Today's going to start a very intense month because this whole month we're going to dedicate to the Vatican museums. When Deborah brought up that we can do the pilgrimages, obviously we started with the churches because that's also something that, you know, as a pilgrim you see first, but you cannot really visit Rome without passing the Vatican Museum. So I figured there is so much there, it would be quite ridiculous to put it all into one pilgrimage. So we've divided up into four parts. And so the four parts are going to be today. Number one, which is the Pinacoteca or the picture gallery. Next week we're going to see the hallways, the general Vatican Museum area, if you will. Then in the third week we will see the Raphael rooms, and there's certainly enough there to fill a pilgrimage easy. And then the fourth one will be dedicated to the Sistine Chapel. So for all of you who are looking forward to the Sistine Chapel, we're not going to see that today. And that's also what I always tell everyone at the beginning of the tour, which is the Sistine Chapel is anyway always at the end. So you have to go through the whole Vatican museums in order to reach the Sistine Chapel. So you have to hold your horses. You have to hold and practice the virtue of patience, right? I'm giving you an opportunity to grow in virtue. So they're right there. You have to practice patience. But today we're gonna see the picture gallery, and it's actually very good because all of these three, so the picture gallery, general museums, and the Raphael rooms will give you an introduction or give you a background in order to really appreciate the Sistine Chapel. And I know that you want to go to the Sistine Chapel, but in order to really appreciate the Sistine Chapel, you have to know all of the background. So the map, you already can see it zooms in onto the city of Rome, more closely the Vatican. So this is the map of the Vatican Museum. And here you can see the whole Vatican city-state, as you know, a city-state, right? 44 hectares in size. With about 900 inhabitants, 500 citizens. And there you can see St. Peter's Basilica, you can see the Vatican museums, and you can see the entrance to the Vatican Museum. So in order to get there, actually, if you were to start from St. Peter's, you'd have to walk around the Leonine Wall, which dates back to the 5th century. So we're going to walk by that long wall in order to go to the entrance. Here is an aerial shot where you can see again the Vatican Museum's entrance, which is pretty far away from St. Peter's. As well as the picture gallery, so the Vatican Art Gallery, that's that big building in almost the center of the photo here, and then to the left, that rather inconspicuous roof, which is the Sistine Chapel, and the rather non-inconspicuous roof, which is St. Peter's Basilica. So that's an easy one to spot, obviously. So in order to go to the Vatican,
Jan, I'd like to interject something real quick. For those who've never been to the Vatican Museum, it is a bit not exactly, if I had never been there, I would think that all of the art was in the Vatican Art Gallery. It isn't. There is a lot of art in the actual Vatican Museum. As to what would make it in the Vatican Art Gallery and not in some of the other rooms within the Vatican museums, I'm not really quite sure. But I think that there's some beautiful art in the art gallery that we're going to see today.
What you have to basically, the way I look at it is that the art gallery or the Pinacoteca contains all paintings, everything that is painted. And that's very important because paintings, you want to have a certain air-conditioned room, right? You want to make sure that there's not too much humidity so that the paintings don't get destroyed. And that's why they have a separate building, if you will, for them. So I think that's probably the best way of looking at it. That doesn't mean that they're not paintings also in other places in the Vatican. It just means that that's the proper gallery.
Dr. Bentz, since we stay on that, can we stay on that picture for one more minute, Mary? Can you go back, Deb? Okay. So, where does Pope Francis live? Normally, that is the big building beyond the piazza.
Bob, I'm having a hard time hearing you. You might be covering your mic.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, a little bit better.
So this is Vatican City, and I just thought people might be interested to see some of the finer points with the city of Rome in the background. St. Peter's Square, going up to the Basilica. But over there on the left side is what would we call that white-topped building on the very left side of our photograph? That's
Paul VI Auditorium.
Paul VI Auditorium, or audience hall. And the building in front of that, just to the right of our logo of the pilgrimages, is the Holy Office of the Inquisition. And that's where the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is. And then just above the Paul VI audience hall is a little rectory building. It's called the Fabbrica of San Pietro. And that's the offices of the cardinal who oversees the Basilica of St. Peter's and all the workers and all the records of the St. Peter's Basilica. And then back behind St. Peter's Basilica, you can see a kind of, once you take a look back there in the trees, there's an impressive building. It's actually quite large, but it's small in this picture. But that's the governorate, the governatorato, the mayor's office of Vatican City State, the governor of Vatican City State. And Vatican City continues in those trees. Those are the Vatican Gardens up on all that area around the cupola of St. Peter's. Where the trees are is the Vatican Gardens. And there's a wall at the end of those gardens. And where does Pope Francis live? In the Domus Santa Marta. That's just off the edge of our photograph on the left side, right in the middle there. There's a guest house, the House of St. Martha, where the Pope lives and where the cardinals stay when they have a conclave. But the building was only built in the 1990s, so they've only used it twice, 2005 for the election of Pope Benedict and 2013 for the election of Pope Francis. Where does Pope Benedict live? He lives in the garden just beyond the cupola. Just to the right side of the cupola, you'll see a building, and that is connected to the Mater Ecclesiae convent where Pope Benedict lives in the Vatican Gardens. And then as you go on around, you finally come to the Vatican Art Gallery and to the entrance to the Vatican Museums. And if you come through that long corridor in the Vatican Museums and you come all the way, you come eventually to the Sistine Chapel. So it's about a quarter-mile walk through the hallways, and you reach the Sistine Chapel, and that's where the papal elections are held. And this whole thing is Vatican.
So, Bob, just to be clear, so people are clear. So if we were to look at the arrow for the Vatican Museum entry, yeah, and just walk along that roof, keep walking towards St. Peter's Basilica, and you're going to pretty much end up right there at the Sistine Chapel. And it's a long walk. There are not a lot of bathrooms. There are no places to sit down. So I think I'm looking forward to going into the Vatican Museums this way, because as you can see, there's a lot to see there. There really is.
And the last thing to say, what season of the year was this picture taken?
Natalia, Christmas.
Natale, Christmas time. Why? Why is that?
Christmas tree in the piazza, in the manger scene.
You see the Christmas tree right next to the obelisk in the piazza. So this has to be December. Maybe it's possibly January.
It could be January.
And then the building behind the obelisk, behind the colonnade, is the Papal Palace, the Palazzo Apostolico, the Apostolic Palace. That one with really has 4 stories, and the Pope's room was on the top floor to the right, but Pope Francis chose not to go live there. And in that shadowy area in the middle of that building where there's a cortile, a kind of a square inside of that building, is the Cortile San Damaso. And that's where all the presidents, President Bush, President Reagan, would drive up into the Vatican and into that cortile. You see, it's in that area underneath where that little green roof is. I don't know if you can see it. So there's Vatican City.
All right. So we've walked around Vatican City, and now, Jan, here we are.
Very good. So we're gonna approach the Vatican Museum's entrance, and so actually this is not the entrance, and this is kind of a sneaky way of going by it, but this is actually the exit. It used to be the official entrance of the Vatican up until Pope John Paul II decided to build a larger entrance because he realized that the Vatican, having a traffic of about 4 million visitors a year, needed a larger entrance hall. And so this hall is very small, and the line immediately went outside and people were waiting outside. So he said, okay, let's keep this, but make this the exit, and let's have the entrance on further to the left. Now, on top here, you see the papal crest, and here you can see the two artists. The papal crest is not so important, but the two artists that will guide us through this tour. So on the left, you see Michelangelo. He has the kind of the full beard, right, and shorter hair. And on the right, you see Raphael. And so these two artists will really be the guiding lights through all of our 4 visits in the Vatican museums. Today, we're going to focus more on Raphael, and Michelangelo obviously will be more important than when we speak about the Sistine Chapel. So when we go to the entrance, we kind of curve around, we go to the entrance, and we have our ticket, we have the pre-booking, so that's good, so we don't have to wait in line. The line is usually very long, okay, so you can already see that people are standing in line around the corner, and that's really where the line is getting really long. Well, once we're inside, we're through the security check. This is the new entrance. This is the entrance that was inaugurated in the year 2000 for the Jubilee year by John Paul II. And so it's a very large space, so people can, get settled, people can get the tickets, people can buy books, buy souvenirs. Okay, we have a souvenir stand, and there are some books that are better, some books that are worse that are sold here. Just some of them are just very detailed, some of them are just a little bit like kind of silly and have a quite random selection. So I always wonder why the Vatican doesn't take better care of the books that they offer there. But nonetheless, there are some really good ones in there. And you go through the ticket booth. So here we can buy the ticket and then go through the security check into the Pinacoteca. Here is again the map, because now we have officially entered the Vatican city-state. And as you know, the Vatican is its own little independent country. Okay, so it has independent legislation from Italy. It has its own taxes. It has its own train system. It has its own, gas station with their own gas prices, which is very low, and also their own supermarkets. So if you do want to go shop in the Vatican, you actually need a special card that you can only get when you are a citizen there, if you're or if you work there, if you're registered as one of the workers. I always like to say that the Vatican has the highest amount of immigration in the world of all countries, because the population triples every morning at 9 o'clock, and then at 5 o'clock everyone emigrates again, goes back, because it's obviously all of the Italians from Rome that work here. So you have lay people work here, you have a clergy working here. And then some people also live here. To get an apartment as a cardinal or as a bishop very much depends on what your rank is, what your office is, and if you have put your name early enough on the list of on the waiting list. Right. So some people can live in the Vatican. Some have to live outside in the Borgo, which is the area to the right bottom of this map, where you can see a couple of you can't see anything, but it's outside the Vatican, just outside the wall, basically.
And I'd like to mention too that a lot of our friends who work inside the Vatican, some of them who work in the Doma Santa Marta in the kitchen area, or they help keeping the domus clean, they live at least an hour outside the city. So people come from very far sometimes. Some people have an hour and a half commute to get into work. So it's so expensive in Rome to live, and this is how they survive, by living so far out.
Very true. Good. So as you can see, again, the Vatican Art Gallery is a little bit off the main path of the large hallways of the Vatican Museum. So here you can see it on the left side, and that's where we're going to enter now. Now the Pinacoteca, as I said, collects all of the artwork that is painted. And mind you, that the Vatican is open to the public nowadays is something that is very special. And this is always something that I like to point out when you hear, on, I don't know, Discovery Channel or documentaries, you hear, well, why doesn't the Pope, who preaches about poverty, why doesn't he just sell all of the works of art and give that money to the poor, right? This is an argument that you often hear. And what I like to respond to that is always that whoever says that does not really understand what art is, and does also not really understand the mission of the Vatican, and does not really understand the mission of the Pope either. Because the Vatican Museums are actually the second oldest museum that is registered as a museum in the world, only second to the Capitoline Museums, which were opened by the same person. Pope Sixtus IV also happens to be the guy who built the Sistine Chapel, right? It's named after him. And we'll speak about him later on. But the Vatican Museum has opened as a museum in order to not just have art in the ownership of private people. Okay, most of the commissions that we see today were commissions by really rich aristocratic Italians, from Rome, from Florence, from Naples, by rich cardinals, okay, or by the Pope himself. And that would mean that if you commission a painting, that painting or that work of art, whatever it may be, hangs in your own living room, right, or in your dining hall. And if that's the case, then people cannot see it. Because you have a Raphael, you have a Caravaggio, you have a Michelangelo, but no one else can participate in that. And so Sixtus IV very early on understood that art is not just something that should be property of an individual person, but should be something that should be shared with everyone, specifically art that comes and that is painted by the great masters like Raphael or Da Vinci or Giotto. Okay, and so he said, okay, well, let's make this accessible to the public. The first Vatican Museum was actually not a museum, it was a library, and that was registered in the 1470s as such. So people could come in. And so for 500 years, okay, a little bit over 500 years, now people have visited the Vatican Museum, the private house, if you will, the private castle, if you will, of the Pope, and can visit and can participate in the beauty. And that is really what the Pope wanted to do. It is the participation of the faithful in the art, so that not just those who can afford an expensive work of art, who can commission it, can enjoy it, but everyone who can afford a ticket. And Pope Francis in recent years has actually even had tours for homeless people of Rome in the Vatican Museum. So even those who cannot afford a ticket are allowed to participate in the beauty of the art in the Vatican. So I always like to point that out, because if it were sold, so if the Pope would sell all of the art, then what would happen? It would go into private ownership. And then it would be in private palaces once again, and no one would see it, and we wouldn't be able to have a tour. So having this open, having this accessible to the public is a very central idea to Christianity, because Christianity does not make, or Catholicism specifically, does not make a distinction between poor and rich, but everyone in the face of God is the same. So that, I think, should be emphasized.
Doctor.
All right. Yes, Bob, go ahead.
One thing from this picture, it's very interesting for our pilgrims to notice. We are taking the photograph from the Dome of St. Peter's. We are looking first right down on the Sistine Chapel where that arrow is. That's and the far end of that to the right is where the smoke comes out. Then we're looking into a courtyard inside the Vatican Museums, which I estimate are 400 yards long. And in that courtyard, if you look into the courtyard, you'll see a white door in the back corner in the shadow there. And that's the entrance to the Vatican Library. So if you're a scholar studying, you come into Vatican City with a pass and you spend the day in the library. You go in that door and you can see ancient manuscripts. And it's, as far as I know, the largest collection of ancient and medieval manuscripts in the world. Manu means by hand, and starting in the late 1400s, in 1500, let's say, we started to have printed books. Prior to 1500, or call it 1453 with Gutenberg, everything was written by hand. The human race did not have any printed books. But that's the library, and the library goes down about 100 or 200 feet under the ground there. Those are the famous underground passageways of the Vatican, and they're temperature controlled. And then on the left side of that courtyard is the Vatican Secret Archives. So you're looking into the very heart of the Vatican here as you look at this photograph of the Vatican museums.
Very true. Very good point. All right. Well, let's begin, and let's enter the Pinacoteca proper. There we go. That's the floor plan.
Before we do, there's always the beautiful view of the cupola as we walk into the Vatican museums, and then we go outside to enter into the separate building for the art gallery. And this is...
It's the bookmark, right? It's Michelangelo's bookmark. So the first bookmark we have is the dome, and the last bookmark we'll have is the Sistine Chapel. So there's the beginning and the end, right? The alpha and the omega of the tour is Michelangelo's works of art.
And of course, off to the right, you overlook the Vatican Gardens. It's just really beautiful outside there. And here we go. Andiamo.
Andiamo. That's right. As you could see on the floor plan, the Pinacoteca is basically one long corridor, and that corridor is split up into multiple rooms. And so these rooms are chronologically ordered. And the chronological ordering allows us to have a passage through 4 centuries of art and the development of art. Last week, we looked at Caravaggio. We looked at a Baroque, early 17th century painter. Today, we're going to start a little bit earlier, and I'm going to walk you from iconography to Raphael. And that's what we're going to spend our time with today. Those, 3 centuries, fundamentally, starting in the 12th century, ending in 1400, so in the 15th century, right, in 1450s, when the Renaissance was really at its peak. So just that you know what kind of framework we're talking about. There is more even in the Pinacoteca. We could spend a whole month in this Pinacoteca if you wanted to. Okay, we can spend hours and hours. You can give a tour just of the Pinacoteca. Okay, and you spend 4 hours in there during a day, and that's it, and you're going to be exhausted. We don't want to do that today. I wanted to pick some highlights to point out the progression of art from the 12th century to the 15th century. And I think 3 words or 3 central concepts are of prime importance in that progression. And those 3 concepts are catechesis, so teaching, catechesis, meditation, prayer, meditation, and participation. And I'll get to explain all of those 3 terms, but keep that in mind. Catechesis, meditation, participation. The whole of Western art has its root and its genesis, its origin in iconography. And this is why we have to start with iconography. And this first icon it's perfectly placed, and I love Antonio Paolucci. He was the one that kind of reorganized a little bit. He was the second to last Vatican director. He put the first painting that you see, the first icon that you see, is actually the Last Judgment. And this was a smart guy. He was like, Last Judgment, you start with the Last Judgment and you end with the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. So for all of the pilgrims, for all of the visitors of the Vatican Museum, he gives you the perfect beginning as a comparison. And he says, look, if you want to understand the grandness of Michelangelo, you have to understand what iconography is first. And so here we have, and I'm sure that most of you have seen the Last Judgment of Michelangelo at some place or another. And if you haven't, that's good. We will see it together. But it looks very different from this. Michelangelo's Last Judgment is populated with muscular, nude figures who are communicating with one another, who are in very, very dynamic poses. Okay, whereas this icon is very, very, well, I should say maybe cold or even kind of rational, not to say, well, not particularly pretty. Okay, you already judge art today by Renaissance standards. You look at this and you say, well, it's not really pretty. Okay, if you have the option to hang this up or Michelangelo's Final Judgment in your salon at home, in your, I don't know, in your guest room, you probably will pick Michelangelo over this. But we should not underestimate iconography, because this is where it really all started. So this is attributed to two artists that are unknown. We just know their first name. So it's Nicholas and John. Okay, Niccolo e Giovanni, Nicholas and John. And it basically gives us a brief teaching summary of the faith. All right. So what is that summary? So on top here, you see Christ, the King of the universe. Okay, that's the first level. And the levels are actually, or the layers are actually separated by lines. Okay, underneath, you see Christ again celebrating Mass, surrounded by his apostles. Everything still taking place in heaven. Everyone has a halo, right? So that's an indication that we're in heaven. The third is a combination of the works of corporal mercy to the right. And so you can see very clearly the dressing of the naked, the visiting of the imprisoned, and giving the thirsty to drink. And then on the left, you have St. Paul guiding the elect into the promised land, which is the kingdom of God. So that's the third layer from the top. The fourth layer is the judgment proper. And there you have angels kind of holding up little tiny naked people, little tiny naked souls, okay, before the throne of judgment. And the throne of judgment is obviously the highest level, which is Christ in his kind of pan-creator state, on his throne, on his cosmic throne. And then on the very bottom, so that rectangle that is added on the bottom, on the left, you have heaven. And the Queen of Heaven stands in the middle in a prayer position, right? We've talked about this in the catacombs, right? The prayer position, Mary. And then on the right, you have hell. And hell is actually a relatively short, a relatively small part only. It's only that kind of rounded red layer, okay? The lava, the heat. And then you have angels, very, very cute. Again, very like almost comicish, right? And with their pitchforks, like, poking the souls in the inferno. So what do we see here? We see a very short, a very brief catechism of the Christian faith. Okay, you have God the Creator, God the Judge, Jesus Christ the Savior, and then your life. You follow St. Paul, you do the spiritual acts of mercy, you have the corporal acts of mercy, and when all of that is done, when you come to the end of your life, you return nude and naked, okay, so without any of your possessions, without any of your property, you return to the judge. And that judge will be Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ will say, well, look, I have lived a life that you know from the Gospels. I was crucified for you. I've taken away sins. What have you done in your life? And that's when you answer, well, I have visited the sick, and I have clothed the naked, and I have given the thirsty to drink, and I have counseled the ones that have wrong opinions, and I have spread the gospel. And then God says, okay, you can join me and my flock. And he kind of leads you to the Virgin Mary. Or if you have failed to follow his commands, well, you go to the place of hell. That is here the place of torment and torture, right? Where there's gnashing of teeth. All right. That's the story. That's the content. But art historically, what can we learn from this? We can learn from this that this art, 12th century icons, and for that matter, icons that were painted before, or that were written, I should say, before the 12th century, they're not written in order to be beautiful. If you want to understand the striving for greatness of Renaissance artists, of all of these names that are so famous, Da Vinci and Raphael and Giotto and Michelangelo and Ghirlandaio and all of these great shots, okay, if you want to understand what they did and why they did it and why we consider them as revolutionaries, is they said, okay, we get this, we get the teaching, we get the content, but we want to make it look better. Okay, and nothing really changes content wise. We have the same stories, everything that I just showed you: the judgment, Christ on his throne, Mary on her throne, St. Paul, the apostles, acts of mercy, judgment. Those are all the themes that we still see for 4, 5, 6 centuries to come in all of art. But this particular style of art is predominantly occupied. It predominantly wants to teach. This is written, this is painted for a peasant that could not read in a medieval church, okay, that I don't know, worked on the field for 10 hours and then on Sunday would go to mass, and they would look at it and they would understand. They would look at it and say, oh, okay, Jesus, okay, he's really important, so he's really big, like we've seen in St. Paul's Inside the Walls, right? In iconography, stuff that's important is really big, right? Stuff that's less important, like the Pope, remember that? Nicholas III, tiny, tiny, tiny Pope. There you go. What's really big is important. What's really small is not so important. Okay, what do I have to do? Oh, okay, there's Jesus with his apostles. Okay, I want to be like Jesus and his apostles. What do I have to, oh, okay, I have to do the acts of mercy. You would not need to study, you know, art history in order to understand this. You would look at it and you would look at what the figures do and you would be like, oh, okay, I understand. I have to bring a shirt to the naked person. Got it. I need to give, you know, a little bit of water to the person who is thirsty. And then they would listen to the homily, and the homily would ideally say the same thing. So this art was not preoccupied with looking good. It was not preoccupied by looking pretty or by looking beautiful. It was preoccupied by getting the message right. And that is also where we get our canon of colors, of figures, of posture, of composition in art from. We get it from iconography. And in an icon, Mary is always wearing blue, because blue is the color of meditation. And Mary meditates the mystery of the incarnation because she experienced it firsthand, pretty much as firsthand as you can experience it. Okay, so she knows that she is the participating in the mystery. And so icon painters would not change the color because they're like, well, I mean, if you now all of a sudden make her yellow, or if you make her, I don't know, pink, then, well, we don't really know if that's going to bring the message across, right? So let's stick with blue. So icon painting was always very, according to very strict rules. And that's just how it was. So that's why it basically all looked the same. And I have to say myself, when you stand in there, I usually have to get people kind of invested into it before they start, you know, wowing or something. Because they look at it and say, okay, well, it's kind of a two-dimensional, pretty ugly, like unproportionate human figure. I don't care. Like, there's some gold, fine. You know, and I understand that. I understand that because it's not made to attract you. It's made to teach. So keep that in mind. Okay, keep that in mind while we move on. Now, we're not going to leave icons behind us completely for now. We're going to look at another icon. This is not an icon, but this is in the same room, so I have to point it out. It is actually just across the room. So it's not an icon, but it does tell a cool story that I always like to point out. For Americans specifically, because this is the story of Saint Nicholas, and there's a whole life cycle of Saint Nicholas. You can all the story, right, of the Bishop Nicholas, and there is one story of Saint Nicholas's miracle, one of the miracles that he performed, which was that there were some seafarers and some sailors, and they came into a storm, and you can see this here on the right. Right, so on the left you have the blue sky, and Nicholas is, you know, waving the ship goodbye. But then the ship comes into a storm, and they kind of toss stuff overboard and hope that they don't sink. And they started praying to the bishop and to Saint Nicholas. And so Saint Nicholas was seen in the sky, flying in the sky, and then the storm calms down, and the ship can actually reach the harbor peacefully. why am I pointing out the story, and why is it so interesting for Americans? That is the reason why Santa Claus is flying through the sky on a sled. He is flying because Nicholas is flying. And as you know, Santa Claus is modeled after St. Nicholas. So I always point it out. And it is across the room, so I may as well, even though we're kind of skipping ahead here in the chronology. Very good. Bob, if there's nothing to add, then we can move further to the triptych by Stefaneschi. So this triptych is in the next room, and here we have, you can see it's about 100 years later, 1330, and here already we have slight changes. Okay, it is still an icon, but we already have, there is something that's different. And maybe you look at it, you're like, yeah, this is different. What's happening? What is new about this? What is striking? Well, the first thing that I should tell you about this is what's striking about this is that this is actually the screen that was put up in St. Peter's Basilica. This was the original screen that screened, like an iconostasis, that screened the Pope's altar from the people. So again, it was a catechetical, a teaching instrument for the people. And so what you saw on this, every single pilgrim that went to St. Peter's Basilica would have seen. Okay, it's super, super important. What do you see? You see the first Pope. There you come to St. Peter's Basilica, and this is obviously not the basilica that we see today, but the first St. Peter's Basilica that was built under Constantine's reign. And you can see the Pope, the first Pope Peter, on his throne, and you would see that, and right behind it would be the altar of where the current Pope, whoever it may be, at the time of your visit to Rome, celebrated Mass. So you have Peter, and you have today it will be the 265th successor, the 266th Pope, Pope Francis. So Peter and Francis, right next to one another. What is the change from the previous iconography? And I think the easiest changes to pick out are really two. Number one, perspective. The Pope sits on a throne, and that throne is three-dimensional. It doesn't really look that fancy yet. Okay, it's not. There's no shadow. Okay, there's a three-dimensional room. Okay, there's a three-dimensional throne, and so all of a sudden you have a space in the icon that you can populate. And in this case, it's populated by the Pope. It's populated by saints, by two bishops, and by the angels standing behind the throne. Right? So you have a three-dimensionality. And the second aspect is that the faces look more three-dimensional. Okay, the first icons, they're all flat. They're two-dimensional. Okay, because it was not about reality. It was not about realism. It was about teaching, the content. Here, there's already this understanding that you want to really see that these are human beings. They're not just like a two-dimensional, like a stick figure, but they are real human beings. So Stefaneschi, in this case, chose to have three-dimensionality coming in. Now let's walk around the triptych and let's look at the other side of the same triptych, because it's a screen, so it has two sides.
Documentary online, and
okay. On this side, okay, you see what the people would have seen. Now on this side, on the second side, you see what the Pope would have seen, and the Pope obviously doesn't have to be reminded that he is the successor of Peter, so he would have seen the big boss, right? Big G in heaven. He would have seen Jesus Christ on the eternal throne of glory. And there you have it. You have Jesus Christ in the middle. You have the angels in glory in a golden background. Remember, we talked about this. Golden background means heaven, surrounding Jesus. You have Pope Nicholas III on the bottom as a very, very small figure again. So we keep with the original iconography that you've seen in St. Paul's. You've seen this in St. Mary Major. You have seen this in the Lateran. Big people important. Jesus Christ really big. The Pope Nicholas not so important, small. Remember? So we keep with the same logic, but now everything is three-dimensional. Christ sits on a three-dimensional throne. The faces are still relatively stern, relatively cold, but nonetheless they're three-dimensional. And so you have the first element, which will lead us to the next stage of development in art, and that is perspective. Okay, let me just briefly touch on the two sides, okay, and these are obviously very important, and we've already mentioned the importance of Peter and Paul always being together. So Peter is on the left, crucified upside down, right? So you have that story, and we talked about this last week. So Peter being crucified, but not wanting to die like his master, Jesus Christ. So he gets turned around, the cross gets turned around, and that's the, this is Peter for you. And then on the right side, you have the beheading of Paul. So you have the death of Peter and the death of Paul right next to one another. Paul, you can see on the right, on the bottom, okay, you can see Paul, and he just lost his head. So the head is on the floor, bouncing 3 times. And as Bob explained in the previous pilgrimage, also with Inside the Vatican, you always go to the Church Tre Fontane, which commemorates that place of beheading of St. Paul. And so the 3 fountains, the 3 gushes of blood that his head kind of spurred when it bounced, right? So the 3 fountains. And you have another story, and this is a very cute story, and I must repeat it because Stefaneschi found it most important, even to put on the triptych, you know, of the Pope. So I have to repeat it. In the background, you see a slope, right? You see a hill, like a hill, and then there's a house on the hill, and on the left side of that slope is a little blue figure, which is a woman. Okay, it's a woman, and she has this kind of piece of cloth that she seems to be throwing into the air. She actually doesn't throw it, but it actually comes down. Okay, and so the story that as it goes is that Saint Paul, on the way to his execution, came by a woman, and he asked her for a handkerchief to wipe his sweat. And it was very hot. It's a typical Roman day, so it was very hot. And she said, "Yeah, sure," but she was a little bit, stingy. She just said, "Well, I mean, if I give you my, you're gonna be beheaded. So if I give you my handkerchief, I'm gonna lose this really nice handkerchief." And it was like a really nice handkerchief that my mom wore for me. So I don't really know if I want to give you that handkerchief, but fine. And Paul said, "Don't worry, you'll get it back." So he takes the handkerchief of this Roman lady, he wipes his face, he puts it in his toga, he goes, he gets beheaded, and then once he comes to heaven, he pulls out the handkerchief and he drops it down from heaven back into the lady's lap, into the lady's hands. And so on the right, in that little part of the triptych, you can see on the top a little blue circle, which is St. Paul in heaven, dropping the handkerchief and the lady receiving it back. Maybe reminds you a little bit of the Veronica story, right? So, but I always love that. It's a very kind of cute feature. And again, we have here also this idea of multiple instances of time in one moment, right? So the beheading as well as Paul in heaven. All right. Now we go further to the next room, and this is, there are 2 paintings here. This one is actually not super important for art history, but it is important for our tour, because here you see all of the important figures of the Vatican Museums, which is Pope Sixtus IV, seated. Okay, so his name is Della Rovere, which means of the oak tree. And so you have acorns on the side in the columns. You have his nephew, Giuliano della Rovere, or Julius della Rovere, and Julius will become a succeeding pope, which is Pope Julius II, and he will build St. Peter's Basilica. And you have the guy kneeling in front of the Pope, which is Platina, and Platina is the first director of the Vatican Museums, if you will. More correctly, I should say, the first director of the Vatican Library. So you have Pope Sixtus IV, who is the builder of the Sistine Chapel. That's where the Sistine Chapel gets her name from, right? Sixtus Sistine. I did once have people on the tour that asked me, where are the other 15 chapels? And you're like, no, that's not what is meant by that. So Sistine Chapel. And then you have Julius II, who built St. Peter's Basilica, and Platina, who was the director of the Vatican Library. So I just wanted to point out these 3 figures so we can move on. Now, just across okay, just across this painting of Sixtus IV, we have a painting that not many people look at because it's not a master, but it will help us to understand the next stage of art. And we are dealing with a whole other world. This is just about 200 years, and look how much has changed. Okay, we have still the typical iconographical positioning. So we have Mary being very important. So she sits on a pedestal, which kind of logically does make sense. I mean, Mary's seat is probably not on this gigantic, pedestal in the middle of a room. It's clearly something that you take from an icon where the most important figure is higher up and in a prominent position. I mean, this would be a very uncomfortable TV chair if you ask me. So you have Mary in the middle, high up, and then you have the saints all around her. So who we got? We got some of the important ones. We got John the Baptist in his red robe. We have Peter with the keys in hand and with the book of his letters, or the book of the chosen, in his hand. Behind him on the far right side, you have a friar in black and white habit, which is a Dominican, and that is Saint Dominic. He has a little house in his hand because he founded an order, the Dominican order. Then on the in the very far back, you have Anthony the Desert Father, who always looks a little bit grumpy. Okay, so he is like the grumpy desert father. If you live in a desert and you try to get away from society like that, you're just going to be a little bit grumpy. Okay, so that is Anthony the Grumpy. And then on the other side of Mary, you have Anthony, the Franciscan Anthony, who helps us find stuff all the time, as you know, and he is basically the patron saint of finding your car keys. And then on the left side, you have Saint Lawrence, who was a deacon, and he was grilled, right? He was grilled on a grill, so he has a grill in his hands. You can see that in his right hand, kind of a little bit off the picture, is his grill. And then in the front, you have John the Baptist. So Peter, Dominic, Anthony the Desert Father on the right, and John, Lawrence, and Anthony the Franciscan on the left. Why am I showing you this? Okay, you've never heard of Parmigiano. This is not a master. Okay, who cares? Right? Who cares? Well, we care because here you see what has happened over the course of 200 years. Painting is not anymore about teaching. It is still about teaching. You just learned a lot. You learned the names of these guys. You learned a little bit about their history because of what they have in their hands. You certainly know that Mary's really important. You learn that Jesus Christ was a real human being, a real little baby boy with everything that a little baby boy has. Okay, he's completely naked. So you learned a lot. But the learning, the catechesis, is not in the center anymore. What is in the center is the idea of meditation. And I think what gives it away, what gives it away for me, is the face of Mary. Because the face of Mary is not teaching. It's not this stern face of Jesus that we've seen before, but is in fact the face of someone who meditates. And when you look at this painting just for a moment in silence, the one thing that you are doing is you start to look at their faces, and then you start to think, who are these people? What are they thinking about? What is John the Baptist pointing at? What is Anthony the Franciscan praying to? Why is Anthony the Desert Father so grumpy? Why is Mary in such a recollected state? Right? And those questions are not anymore questions that are invoked by iconography. Those are questions that invite you to take a deep breath and not just learn, but also participate in prayer, meditate about the truths of this painting. Not just of the painting, but of the figures inside. And how does Palmezzano allow you to do that? He puts this all in a three-dimensional corridor, in a three-dimensional room, okay? And you can kind of step in. This painting is not flat. It's not just on your wall, and then behind the wall, behind the icon or behind the painting, there is just wall. This is a wall that actually contains a window to another world. And I always like to, I don't know, you probably, I don't know if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis, but if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis, I can make this reference. You can compare it with Narnia, right? This is the wardrobe. This is what you open, and you go inside, and you're all of a sudden in a completely different world. And this is not the everyday world that you're accustomed to. This is a world populated by saints with beautiful stories, with beautiful faces, with baby Jesus, with the Virgin Mary, and you're all of a sudden surrounded by your buddies in prayer. So it is the entrance to another world. And so that is again done by three-dimensionality, by perspective. And here we have a better idea of three-dimensionality because we have a proper perspective, we have a proper vanishing point, right? The roof of the hallway goes down, the floor kind of goes up, they meet in the middle on the vanishing point, and you have shadow, you have shades, right? The figures themselves cast shadows. The folds are visible because of the shadowy background, and the whole thing is a proper three-dimensional room. Okay, keep this in mind when we go and we meet our next great artist, who will be or who was the teacher of Raphael. So when we move on, you can see everything that I just told you to perfection. And maybe I have to kind of step back here for a second. Whenever there is a great revolution, right? So people love revolutionary figures, right? Whoever it may be, George Washington or Martin Luther King or Lincoln or I don't know, or anyone, any Michelangelo, right? Any great revolutionary is always revered for the revolution. What you have to understand is what's most important about a revolution is the time leading up to the revolution, because that's where the sausage is ground, right? That's where the important stuff happens. And then when a Galileo comes, or when a Copernicus comes by, or when Michelangelo comes by, they always rest their work on centuries of work that was done before, and they just do the last step, right? They just draw the last straw, if you will. And so Perugino is the last development before Raphael comes into place. Perugino is the actual painting teacher of Raphael. Okay, he's from Perugia. That's why it's called the Perugino. And he paints in a style that incorporates or tries to incorporate everything that I've just mentioned. He perfects it. It is, in fact, it's so perfect that everyone says, okay, well, there's nothing else to add. We can just copy Perugino now, right? There is nothing more that we can actually invent, because this is it. This is the perfection of art. We have the teaching, right? Mary is on a pedestal, very uncomfortable TV chair. We have baby Jesus. We have the surrounding by saints. This is all closed into this kind of baldacchino structure that is standing in the open somewhere in the like Tuscan fields. Okay, so you have a beautiful Tuscan background, which is always nice. If you have, someone that commissions the painting from Tuscany, then you want to give them as a background the view from their back window of their, I don't know, summer residence. You have the saints. They all have certain emblems to identify them. And then you have a crazy amount of detail. And so you have the marble slabs are incredibly detailed. The cloth is incredibly detailed. The golden embroidery on Lawrence's tunicella is incredibly detailed. You have, the Virgin Mary's coat is finely painted. The throne has lots of ornaments, lots of embroidery. It just looks phenomenal. And I've been in the Vatican. I've been here with a painter friend of mine, and he told me, Jan, you cannot imagine how difficult it is to paint faces like that. You cannot imagine how difficult it is to paint a face that is so calm and so recollected. Should I say so meditating, so meditative, right? And this is really the key. Perugino wanted to paint in a way that you could look at it, you could learn something, but most importantly, you can pray in front of it. And it's very easy. Look at it. If you had this above an altar in your church, you could very simply, very easily pray in front of it. You can meditate the mysteries of Mary. You can meditate the mysteries of the Incarnation with little baby Jesus. You can meditate on the stories of the saints surrounding. So Perugino did that to perfection. And now we can understand slowly what or why Raphael was such a revolutionary person. So if we turn to our right and we go through a double glass door, we will go into the Raphael room. Now, we're not going to go into the Raphael rooms, the stanzas, as they call them, which he built for the Pope, and that we will see in the third tour, or the third pilgrimage. What we're looking at are three paintings by Raphael that are here preserved in the Pinacoteca, in the picture gallery of the Vatican. So it's a dark room. It is very well. It has very well air conditioned because these are very precious, and so what we can look at are those three paintings. Now we're going to start with the one on the right. Oh, okay. So we can see, sorry, another view. So you can see that there's actually tapestries around, right? You have tapestries behind glass, and then you have many people flock to these Raphael paintings. All right. So what we look at first is the coronation of the Virgin Mary, or the enthronement of the Virgin Mary, which is dated at 1504. Yeah. Raphael was 20 years old when he painted this. Okay, so that was me 14 years ago. When I was 20, I painted like stick figures. Okay, so that's what Raphael painted when he was 20. So go ahead. This is why I'm not a painter. I just explain the stuff. So you can see the enthronement of Mary, and you basically see a Perugino painting. If you look at the faces, if you look at the logic of it, it is all like Perugino. It's very calm, it's very recollected, it's very detailed, but it is relatively, the word that I should use is, it is relatively static. That'd be a good word. Static. Okay, it's a frozen image. There's little movement. There are two things that are, well, okay, so first of all, obviously we see Jesus and the Virgin in heaven, okay, surrounded by a bunch of really well-versed angels in violin playing and musical, musical instruments. We have all of them having really fancy musical instruments, and they're separated by clouds. Okay, maybe it reminds you of the first icon that we see, right? The separation of the two parts of the painting. So we have heaven, great, and then you have Raphael's tiny angels. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the very, very famous angels of the Madonna Sistina, the one that is like leaning and thinking, and the other one that is kind of like resting on his two arms. The two angels here are the first time that they appear. To the feet of Jesus and to the feet of Mary, you see two angels, and then Raphael kind of puts them together and puts them into the Sistina Madonna later on in his life. Okay, and on the bottom we see the apostles, which are a little bit confused and confuzzled about Mary's empty tomb. Right, they go to the tomb and they see, oh, there are lilies in there, but there's no body of Mary, because body was assumed. But Mary was assumed into heaven by her son. So the only movement that you really get, okay, the only movement that you really get are the faces of the apostles, and there you can see more than meditation. There you can see, befuddlement, like people that they're I wouldn't say shock, that'd be a little bit too much, but they are surprised. They are maybe they are maybe a little bit enchanted. Okay, so you look at the faces, and that's what you get. And the faces are, kind of looking straight up, looking straight to the left, looking straight to the right, looking down into it, right? So there is a little bit of movement, but all of the bodies are still kind of in the static motion. They all kind of stand straight, like we know from Perugino. That will change in the next painting, in the Madonna of Foligno, which Raphael paints 9 years later. So we move on, and you can see that here we have a difference. We still have saints standing, but for the first time we have a little bit more creativity in their positioning. And we can see Mary, who is reclining on the clouds, right? You have little baby Jesus that's in a very active pose. Okay, this is a baby that does not want to be held right now. He wants to go down, he wants to crawl, he wants to touch stuff, he wants to, I don't know, rip on Mary, he wants to rip down Mary's tablecloth, right? And have everything shattered on the ground. That's baby Jesus that's really active. Like, he does not want to sit there right now with mommy, okay? He doesn't want to sit model for poor Raphael. So you have this kind of very active baby Jesus. And then on the bottom, again, still the separation, right? Still the separation, but this time Mary reclines down onto earth. So there is not a clear line between upper painting and lower painting. There is a merging of the two. It's the same world, right? Mary in heaven and us on earth are in the same world. What? That's, wow, okay. And then you have the saints around it. You have Francis praying. You have the cardinal who commissioned it, whose name Raphael left out from the little wooden plaque because he didn't pay him in full. So he's still on it, but he left out the. And then you have John the Baptist on the left, pointing to Mary. And this is something that's already fascinating. This was painted for a side chapel, and it was not the altarpiece. This was because it was an early Raphael, so he just got, he was already famous, but he didn't get only the best commissions. So he got the one that would be on the left side. So do you remember in Caravaggio, during the pilgrimage with Caravaggio, we saw that there is a main piece that was over an altar, and then you have the two sides, right? And so this would have been on the left side, which means that John the Baptist looks at you and points up. And this is a very, very important indicator, okay? And I always love it when, when the artists of like the 50s and 60s and 70s of the 20th century, like, they, for the first time, included, the viewer, the audience into the paintings. Like, no, sorry, that was 500 years ago. We already had that, sorry. So that point of connecting the audience to what's presented, that will be Raphael's breakthrough. So let's look at his final grand masterpiece, and really the grand masterpiece of his life, which is the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration was painted for St. Peter's Basilica. Okay, it is still in St. Peter's Basilica, but as a copy, as a mosaic copy. This painting is the original that he painted. He painted with his studio, okay, and actually Raphael died while painting it. So this is dated in 1520, and this is the date that Raphael died. He died in 1520 with 37 years of age, very, very young, but he died having seen, I guess, or having conceived of his greatest masterpiece. And this is something that is really common among artists. Think of Mozart. Think of Michelangelo, right, who dies and never really sees the dome finished. Think of Dante, who finishes the Divine Comedy and dies. Think of Raphael. He paints the Transfiguration, and he doesn't even see it finished. In fact, he only colored the upper part. The cartoon, so the background, is all by Raphael, but only the upper part is colored by him. The lower part is colored by his students after his death. And if you look closely, or if you step back for a moment and you kind of look up, you move with your eyes up and down, you can see that the colors are a little bit different. They're a little bit starker on the bottom. They're more intense, more saturated on the bottom, because his students did not really get those kind of nice hues of color that he used. Either way, what are we looking at? we're looking at two, and let's explain first of what we look at, and then I explain you why it's important. We're looking at two juxtaposed scenes, okay, separated in the middle, not by a line, but by mountain. On the lower part, we see the scene from the Act of the Apostles, where there is a couple, and that couple brings to the apostles their son, and he is possessed. That's what they say. So he's sick, he's possessed. And you can see him on the right side. His two parents are, and there's a lot of figures here, so it may take you a second to find them, but there are two parents. One is with a brown hair, brown beard. That's the father, and then his mother is a little bit lower, both wearing green in the hope, right? Green hope to have him saved or have him cured. And you have the boy stretching out his arms, one to the sky and one to the earth. He is between heaven and earth, right? He is somewhere in the middle. And then there's a small detail which is hard to see on this image now, which is that his eyes are kind of googly and kind of looking outwards. So he is possessed. Okay, the point is he is possessed. Okay. And then on the left, you have all of the apostles reacting to this moment. And here we don't just have them standing stern and looking up and looking to the side and looking to that. No. They are engaged, okay? They're pointing at the boy. They're pointing up. They're pointing towards each other. They're talking. They're like really unsettled in this moment. And you can feel it, right? There's a lot of commotion going on the bottom. And the parents are like freaking out about the apostles freaking out, right? They're like, well, you cannot even help him. What are we supposed to do? Who are we supposed to go to if you cannot even help him? I look at the father's eyes. He's shocked. He's like, I thought you guys had it. You know, I thought you guys would be the answer. Okay, and then you have the upper part, which is the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is the moment when Jesus takes his favorite or most important three apostles, Peter, James, and John, up on a hill, okay, and then he appears to them as God. He appears in this white robe, right? And so Moses and Elijah come kind of flying by, flyby shooting, right? So like a flyby, and they hover next to Jesus, and he reveals his power. Okay. What's fascinating is that Jesus, even though he is probably in the most active figure in this composition, he seems incredibly calm. And if you look, so if your eyes get kind of confused on what's going on the bottom, then you look to Jesus, and Jesus has his hands open like that, right? And you kind of feel like you can rest there. And it's not because it is actually the quietest spot in the painting. In fact, it is even more in commotion than the bottom. Moses and Elijah are struggling to stay close to Jesus because he's so powerful. They're like, they get getting pushed away by the power that he exudes. And the apostles are in the moment of falling down. John, who's wearing this pinkish red robe, is in the moment of falling. He hasn't even hit the ground. Like, he is in the air falling. Peter just kind of hit the ground and is shielding his eyes, right? So there's a lot of motion. But you look at Jesus, and it's quiet. Okay. Two more indications that Raphael wanted you to see it like that. Number one, Jesus is the only light source in the painting. Like Caravaggio, like what Caravaggio copies 90 years later, is the sun is setting or rising. It's kind of unclear. I would say it's setting, but fine. The sun is not visible. And you can see it in the back. In the background, the sun is kind of going down, right? So you don't see the sun. So all of the light in the painting is actually Jesus. And if you draw lines of the light source, right? If you would take like a flashlight and you would kind of recreate the scene, you would, kind of light it down, then you would see all of the illumination from the bottom comes from the top, which for your eye, and this is something that Raphael learned from his one of his masters, which is Leonardo da Vinci, your eye is always drawn to the light source. Wherever you look at a painting, you want to look where the light source is. It's just, that's natural because your eye reacts to light. That's just biology. So when you are looking at the bottom, you're getting confused, your eye is immediately drawn up because you're like, light source, light source, light source. Well, okay, there it is, Jesus. Number one. Number two, all of the lines of movement, the diagonals, go up. And so when you stand in front of this in St. Peter's Basilica, the closest point of that painting that touches your world is Peter's foot. So where's Peter? Peter's on the left bottom, wearing blue and kind of this cream-colored robe. And his foot is stretched out to the viewer. So we literally start by looking at Peter's big toe. We look at that toe, we go up to the knee, we go up to his shoulder, which is highlighted, we go up to his balding head, which is highlighted, we go up to the shoulder of Matthew, we follow that line and we reach the finger of Matthew, pointing up. If you start on the other side, you start with the foot of the Muse, kneeling down. You go up, her buttocks, her left buttocks is highlighted. You see that. Her exposed shoulder is lit up. You follow her arms to the kid. The kid reaches up, you look up the hand, and there you see the hand of another apostle, which is open, okay, pointing up. So all of what you're doing with your eye is you're being drawn up. Now let me interpret this for you. On earth, there is chaos. On earth, there is unrest. But whatever possession, sickness, sin, unrest there may be, you look up, and when you look up to Jesus and you see him in his power, in his transfigured state, that's the solution. And that ultimately is the solution for the parents. The apostles don't know what to do, but they do know what to do. They say, look up, there is your solution. And that is Jesus Christ, and your eye kind of hops up and look at Jesus, and you meditate, and you say, he is my solution. So, what are we doing? And here comes the third word. We are participating. Catechesis, meditation, participation. What you are doing with your eye, what, in one phrase, what Raphael forces you to do with your eye is to participate in the very action of the subject of the painting. You are not just looking at it. You are not you're not just learning from it. You are not even meditating it. You are participating in the action. And that, my friends, is the culmination of Renaissance art. This is arguably the culmination of Western art, but it's definitely the culmination of Renaissance art, which will then translate to Baroque, where that action for 100 years is in the center of attention. And that's why Baroque churches are always so maybe overburdening or there's just so much going on. It's because you're supposed to participate. So here we see then the Transfiguration in its natural habitat, quote unquote, which is St. Peter's Basilica. So this is what it is. It is a mosaic. Okay, so this is not the painting. This is the mosaic. Okay, and what I always like to point out is that the Muse that you see in the foreground is actually one of Raphael's girlfriends, which is also a painting that you can see and visit in Rome, which is the Fornarina. So we have one more shot from the actual mosaic in St. Peter's, right? And if we were in the church, we can go there now because that's actually pretty far away from the Pinacoteca, and you can see the tiny stones, right? You can make out that it's made up of tiny stones. So the front, that lady in blue and in rose, right, that points to the boy's heart with her finger, and she's the Muse. She could be charity, she could be counsel. In the Renaissance, when women are allegories, it's not always necessarily completely clear. I would say it's charity, but so she, you know, in your charity, dear apostles, please help this boy. If you look at her face, okay, we can actually recognize one of Raphael's girlfriends, which is the Fornarina, which is in the Barberini gallery. So you can, we can move on and show that painting real quickly. There you go. So that's her. So what you cannot see is, just because of the censoring, is the strip around her arm, which actually says the word Raphael. Okay, so he signed the painting, but he also kind of claimed his girlfriend. Raphael was a very handsome guy, and he had lots of girlfriends everywhere. Unlike Michelangelo, by the way, who tried to live a more austere life. So being a prince and being able to afford, you know, tons of mistresses. This was one of them. She is the daughter of one of the bakers of Trastevere. That's why she's called the baker's daughter, which is in Italian can be rendered as Fornarina. Fornaio would be baker, so Fornarina is like the small female baker. And so this is one of the you know, kind of I don't know, like trivial pursuit questions of this painting, right? Who is the lady? So it's a Fornarina. Good. Now we can go to the next room, because we are also coming to an end. We can go to the next room, and we stumble by this unfinished, kind of strange looking painting, honestly, which does happen to be Da Vinci. So I do want to point it out. This is Saint Jerome by Leonardo da Vinci, and the Vatican was actually so happy to find it, because in the 16th century, one of the curators walked through, you know, the streets of Rome, and there was like a garage sale thing going on, and they had this painting, that the canvas, and used it for, and it's wood, it's painted on wood, so it's 3 wooden beams, and they used it as a table and as a stool. And so the curator walked by, it's like, wait a second, that's a painting. And so they put it together, and they realized it's actually Da Vinci. So that's just a cool story. And it's 3 wooden beams that are now put together, obviously, and that are put on display. You can easily tell it's Jerome, because he is in a penitent position, right? He's in a cave where he translates the Bible. And most importantly, he is robed in a red robe, which is not fully colored, and has a lion in front of him, and the lion is the symbol of Saint Jerome. Actually, Bob or Deborah, do you know why the lion is the symbol of Saint Jerome?
No.
I do
The
not.
lion is the... You do not know. It's a story that goes back to his translation in the cave in Jerusalem, right, close to Jerusalem. And so one day, apparently, so he's sitting there translating the Bible, and one day a ferocious lion came into the cave and cornered him. And and this poor old man, he's like, oh my gosh, okay, well, this is my hour. But since he was still a cool saint of the cool days, he actually started wrestling with a lion, because that's what you do when you're a scholar, you wrestle with a lion. And so he got to grab his paw, and in the paw there was a tiny spine. And so he pulled out the spine, and all of a sudden the lion became tame and stayed as Jerome's pet. Which is also showing that he's one of the cool saints of the elden days, right? Where you have a lion as a pet, because that's what you do. So the lion stayed with him, and every artist still replicates that story. So whenever you see a lion anywhere, you know it's Saint Jerome. All right, and then as a final kind of closing moment, as a closing image, we have the Entombment of Caravaggio. I did explain that at length in the last week's tour on Caravaggio. I just wanted to show you, as I mentioned, that it is actually in the Vatican Museum. So this is the next room after Raphael. And I think, like last tour, this will be a great painting to end with. So here we have the Entombment. So we have the school of Raphael, and this idea of participating, taking root, and people like Caravaggio, all 16th century artists copied Raphael. That's just what happened. And that became the standard for art. So everyone emphasized a certain aspect of Raphael that they liked. So the movement, or the composition, or the colors, or in this case, the dark and light, the chiaroscuro together, right? But ultimately, we're all dealing with post-Raphael paintings. kind of how would I say, conditioned by Raphael. That'd be the right word.